Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. Can America ever not be racist? Let's get to the bottom line. The killing of George Floyd by a white policeman in Minneapolis was the spark that brought people to their feet in protests worldwide. It came after a string of killings of many Black Americans. They included Breonna Taylor of Kentucky and Ahmaud Arbery of Georgia. Millions of Americans have been in the streets in cities and towns all over America protesting against the systemic racism that hasn't been fully confronted for decades or even centuries here. So, how did we get here? And can things get better in the future? And is America's way of policing and incarcerating so many Black and Brown Americans working for this society? We are fortunate today to be speaking with Martin Luther King III, son of Martin Luther King Jr., who has spent his life advocating for human rights here in the United States and all around the world. Mr. King, thank you so much for joining us today.
And I would just love to start with your personal reflections on this moment, and how you think we might get through.
What I know is that this is an incredible nation, and yet we continue to, particularly in law enforcement, we continue to do harm to Black people. During my father's era, over 52 years ago, he was marching with sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee, and was killed. Those sanitation workers had signs, and those signs said, "I am a man." Those signs were saying, "Treat me with dignity and respect, and as the human being that I am." 52 years later, all over the streets of America, Blacks and whites and others are saying, "Black lives matter." We're still saying to the nation, treat us with dignity and respect and like the human beings that we are. And tragically, are not getting any relief yet. Now, we may have turned a corner with the tragic killing of George Floyd. And what I mean by that is we've had individuals marching in cities and towns for a few years now. But this one incident galvanized all 50 states. There have been demonstrations. And all over the world, there have been demonstrations. And the demonstrations are not just of Blacks and a few whites. Many of them are overwhelmingly white. And so it's almost like a light went off in the heads of people to say, this is wrong, this is unjust, this is immoral, this is not who we are.
We have a president of the United States, and I'm wondering what you think about President Trump when he's saying, basically we'll sick dogs on them if they cross the fence in the White House. We will deploy the military. We will shoot if there's looting. There'll be shooting. This sounds reminiscent, indeed, of the time your father was protesting.
Well, it certainly is, and I'm greatly disappointed in the president's lack of leadership around this issue. And a president is supposed to bring people together, to quell violence when it is occurring, not to throw gasoline on it and make it grow even more. When the president walked over to the church, it was fine for him to walk over to the church, but what was wrong was pastors. And we'll bring out the military. Holding a Bible, it's a little bit of an oxymoron, a Bible that's supposed to represent peace and change and freedom and justice and a lot of things. And you're saying, I'm going to bring, we'll send the military in. I don't know that we've used the U.S. military on American citizens at any time. We've used the National Guard, but not the U.S. military. So all of that seems to be way off the direction that we should go in. and it certainly is reminiscent of what my father and his team and others have had to endure. I think that there's a huge consciousness in the nation and perhaps throughout the world. And I believe that there's enough of a conscience for during the election time. Right now, people should be mobilizing and organizing and strategizing and agitating and registering and voting. We had in our state of Georgia today was election, and several others had election day. And I believe that more people have come out since the beginning of the election time and to now than we've seen in a long time. And I think that more people will come out in November, which perhaps will mean we'll have a change in leadership at the presidential level. I think that is a real prospect and a real possibility, because I just think the president's on this issue has been a failure.
What you're describing, though, and it's interesting to me, and I think it's important that our listeners know, is you still believe in the American system. You believe in the infrastructure of voting and your role as a citizen, and you're maintaining that. I've talked to a lot of friends in the Black community that are disgusted by the system, see it stacked against them, and they don't participate because they don't feel it's fair or that their vote or their role matters. So I think it's very interesting, the distinction that you've just made there, that you're still in the system, that you believe in it, and it's one that can be brought around. Am I getting that right?
Well, I would say that when people participate, if people and when they participate, then change can come. And yet can come. And I still believe the system can work. Now, if you talk about specifically policing, that's a different discussion, because there's no one fit for all. You know, we're talking about in some communities defunding police departments. And what does that mean? In Minnesota, they're talking about abolishing the department and really starting all over. And that might be the solution for Minneapolis. I don't know. I think every city, every community has to set up its own set of circumstances around police brutality and misconduct, because in more situations than not, the police are the ones who start the activity and cause the violence by their reactions, even though they're trained in how to de-escalate. They don't always operate from a de-escalation standpoint. In fact, more times than not, they don't. We saw just the other day, I believe in Buffalo, where an older white gentleman was pushed over as if he was just, I don't even know how you describe it, didn't exist, just pushed over for no reason, because he was
75-year-old man and left there and bleeding from the ears. No, it was a real tragedy. When we think about, one of the things I've been trying to convey and to find ways to convey, particularly we have a global audience watching this today, is what systemic racism means and what it feels like. And I know that many people go to you because of your own legacy, your own family. How do you describe to others that haven't experienced what you have, what systemic racism is?
Well, systemic racism means that the institutions are engaged in racial activity that discriminate against someone primarily because of the color of their skin. And that is all Black people experience that, no matter who you are. Maybe if you dress a certain way, you may be treated a little differently. But at some point, most Black people are going to experience racism. For me personally, when Dad talked about having a dream where a person would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, he was saying his 4 children, but he was really talking about more people than his children, because certainly because of who I am and who my siblings are, many people know us. So we're sometimes treated slightly differently. But by and large, Black people still experience racism. And it's the system that has to be dismantled. Sensitivity, human relations, diversity training needs to be imposed upon all of society, starting maybe in kindergarten and going all the way through college. I think that we would create a different young person at the end of that experience if he or she was exposed to and understand, there are unconscious bias efforts that occur. I don't think people always consciously are racist. And what I would say is that a child is not born, no child is born racist, but he or she is fostered in an environment where racism is reinforced and they become that which they have, of how they've been raised and socialized. You can overcome that, and many children do. Thank goodness. But we got to change our system. We got to change our systems because the racism is structured throughout the system. I mean, President Trump, for example, has a cabinet that's not reflective of America. It is largely white men. It doesn't even have a lot of white women. It has one black person. But that's it. And when you see him meeting with his military crew, it's all white men. So what does that say to people? That what does that say to masses of people? The only people that are important are white men. So that's what racism is. And that's got to change so that children can aspire to and know that, yes, I'm a part of this system and I have a contribution to make. And in spite of what a president does, there's another way that we can do this.
When you talk about changing things, how do you get beyond the surface acknowledgement and the checking off the box that people went out to protest and really get fundamentally different? Do we need reparations to members of the Black community? Do we need a different kind of action program that solves the incarceration issue? How do we move the needle in a real way rather than a fake way?
Well, first of all, the system is named improperly in my judgment. It is called a criminal justice system. It is a criminal system, but it is not just for blacks, for browns, and for poor whites. And Black people are systematically targeted, are profiled by police departments all over America. That's why, as you stated, 60% of the population can comprise 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 in some cases % of the jail population, because Black people are targeted because of health disparities and a lack of health care in poor communities, which happen to be Black. Black folk have more diabetes, more heart disease, more high blood pressure, more of everything that really is not good. The Black community carries that, and even the brown community. And then it trickles down, of course, to poor whites. But in our society, again, change. My father and his team that took place, and policy created a Civil Rights Act in 64, a Voting Rights Act in 65, fair housing legislation in 68. And so either we have to create new legislation or we have to bolster existing legislation. So it's a combination, I believe. And I think people have to see some very responsible change. It may not have to be tomorrow, but it's going to have to be soon. And those changes are going to have to be implemented. You can't break down and destroy racism tomorrow, but over a period of time, you can transition to be a much different system, so that a year from now, when you measure, you can have metrics that determine, we have reduced this, we've done this, these are the 10 things that we've done, and we've achieved those goals and objectives. And as a result, the African-American community now looks at us differently. Now, that's just in policing. We have to do that in several areas.
We're gonna play a sound clip here of President Trump.
But MAGA is Make America Great Again. By the way, they love African American people. They love Black people. MAGA loves Black people.
When you hear something like that, what's your reaction?
I don't even know what that means. And because my dad talked about making America what it ought to be, not great again. Because what period of time are you talking about? I mean, 60 years ago, well, not 60, about 70 years ago, 65, 70 years ago, black folk were being hung for no reason. Just as George Floyd was murdered the other day, black folk were being murdered left and right for nothing. So I don't know the period in history where America was great. I think we have exhibited times and moments of greatness from time to time, but great again harken back to an era that I can't relate to. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing is that when you talk about we love the blacks, that's impersonalizing people. You know, you didn't say we love black people. We love the people who are a part of the black community. You said we love the blacks. What is some inanimate object? What is that? I mean, that's the way I see it. Now, of course, there are black people who support the president and support his notion of making America great again. But I would say the overwhelming majority do not, because it does not make sense to us. And when you have talked about us, when you've called African countries negative names, and a country like Haiti, which is the poorest country in this Western hemisphere, and by intention, it has been, it has been strangled. When you mistreat people like that, and we are black people, it deeply cuts with us. So I understand what the president says he's doing, but I don't respect or appreciate what it is that he's saying, because his verbiage, his language is even racist. Not necessarily on what he said about MAGA. At a minimum, it's insensitive to call them the blacks. You know, in one of his rallies, he said, "Where's my African American?" There he is. We're not slaves. What do you mean? You're African American. That's part of the problem. Your mentality is that somebody belongs to you, and you don't even have sense enough to realize that that's what you're putting out there. So, that's why it's so imperative that people vote, and we present a different kind of leadership figure for the 21st century.
Through the primary, the Democratic primary, and even more recently, Vice President Joe Biden has used language where he takes it as a given that the black community is automatically with him, and that almost that those aren't really black. But there's a kind of confidence there. Is that as real as Joe Biden thinks it is, or does he still have to earn the support and the respect and the resolve of the black community politically?
I think he has to still earn the support, and any serious candidate. And I believe in his heart he knows that. He may have said something that evoked emotions, but I believe as an elected official who's been elected over 30 years, you have to earn every vote. You can't take any vote for granted. If you don't look at, I think in some of the past tickets, that criticize Hillary Clinton for granted. You can't take anyone for granted. You got to ask people and keep earning their support over and over again if you're going to represent the people. Now, again, I think the majority of African Americans probably will support Joe Biden because of how extreme President Trump has been, and how destructive and disruptive, because he rules from a divisive standpoint. He doesn't seem to understand unification. It would have been wonderful to see him go over to the Episcopal Church with ministers and saying to the nation, we are better than this. We got to come and quail. Not that we'll blow you away or we'll do something like that to you. That's not what was needed. That's the wrong play. And yet, he does all of these different kind of things. And he's an anomaly, because he's been able to get away with all kind of things that the average politician, had he or she done them, they would have had to resign from office. But, when you have a
Sure.
president who has no shame, what do you expect?
Does the Black community support for Joe Biden need for there to be a vice presidential running mate who's a Black woman?
I think that there is certainly growing support for him to choose a Black woman. But I really can't gauge whether or not, if he did not choose one, would that dramatically change his prospects. I don't know that. I do think that there are women. There's a growing group of women, and particularly after the George Floyd incident, I think it's a huge departure from where he may have been. I think that, I think he was looking at Amy Klobuchar, for example. She was the DA prior to this, the DA who's in Minnesota, in Minneapolis right now. And I think that the George Floyd incident probably knocked her out of consideration, Senator Klobuchar. But I also think it bolstered, or certainly in a framing way, made the prospect of choosing an African-American woman more realistic than it was. I mean, I think what I still can't evaluate is, if he does not, for whatever reason, will that hurt him dramatically? And I don't know that at this point.
Final question here, and I know you're probably asked this a lot. Your father gave probably one of the most famous speeches of all time in his "I Have a Dream" speech. I'd like to hear what your dream is. As you look at the anguish, you look at the protests. I've seen lots of young people, black, white, brown, whatever color, out there doing it. It seems inspiring. But I'd love to hear at this point what your dream, or what your father's dream, would be at this moment.
So my dream, my wife and I, Andrea, have a 12-year-old daughter. And we had to sit down on her birthday and explain to her why, after 52 years, her grandfather's life was taken. She knows that, but why these issues have not been resolved. And it because her emotions were, she wanted to just throw something and tear up something. I mean, that was her initial emotion. Obviously, she didn't go in that direction, but that's the emotion. She was going through the anguish. She was crying. She was, just going through all kinds of things. So when it comes to my dream, we live in a country that has a multi-trillion-dollar economy, even with a very terrible economy today because of the pandemic. We still have a there are trillions literally of dollars. When you add the business resources, you add the government resources, when you add the small business resources, it's literally something we can't imagine. So in America, we have the audacity to have poverty. We have, my dad and mom wanted to see poverty, racism, and violence eradicated from our society. Dad did not live to see that come to fruition. Mom worked on it some, and of course, when she passed in 2006, it still had not come to fruition. What I believe and what my dream is that everyone in America should be able to have a decent home. A decent home could be 100 square feet. It doesn't have to be a 5,000, 10,000, 50,000 square foot home, but 100 square feet. In America, everyone should be able to have affordable and decent housing. Everyone should be able to have a decent job. Everyone should be able to have health care, and everyone should be able to have justice. And when that day comes, then I feel the dream that I have will be almost fulfilled. And my daughter and other children who are black and brown and poor white to some degree, she would not have to go through what they're going through. But certainly poor black and brown children should not have to go through what they're going through. This should not be a recurring activity. And I know with the ingenuity, with the ability of just a few good women and men, when ability meets will, there's nothing on the table that we almost cannot do. And so that's what I envision. That's what I will continue to work toward. And I know that we can make it happen. We can, in fact, realized the dream of Martin Luther King Jr. and later on Coretta Scott King.
Well, thank you so much, Martin Luther King III. I think that dream is something that I think a lot of people can subscribe to. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts today at this very troubling but sometimes inspiring time.
Thank you.
So what's the bottom line? The United States is a country where your life expectancy can be 20 years less than your neighbor, depending on the color of your skin or your zip code. Just think about that for a second. Today's protests across the country are not only about justice for George Floyd. Americans, they often rise up and demand justice for all. But let's face it, the deck is stacked and the power structure remains mostly white and mostly male. One thing is for sure, if my guest's father was still around today, I think we'd be much further along. And that's the bottom line.